earthquake and tsunami that struck Japan in March of 2011 caused billions of dollars in damage and also wrecked the Fukushima nuclear power station on the coast. It continues to spew radiation, and some say an even bigger nuclear disaster could be coming. One that, as ABC News reporter David Ono explains, could threaten us here in the Bay Area.
March 11th, 2011, a 9.0 quake hits, the strongest ever recorded in Japan. And then, live from our televisions, we watched a monstrous tsunami annihilate the most prepared country in the world. I saw firsthand the enormous devastation. Entire towns wiped out, piles of rubble 30 feet high. But the third part of this disaster has the potential to be the worst of all, yet the damage is almost invisible. The Fukushima nuclear power plant continues to spew radiation, 5,300 miles from Los Angeles and still not far enough. Deformities are showing up in Japanese butterflies. The once thriving fishing industry near the plant has been shut down. Dozens of species labeled too radioactive to eat. And there's the human toll. 160,000 families have been forced from their radioactive homes, many still paying their mortgages, even though they'll likely never live there again. Fukushima is an enormous problem that's getting bigger.
There are several hundred tons of radioactive water that are pouring into the ocean at the site every day.
That's nuclear engineer Dr. Arjun Makhijani, president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, who confirmed to me that ocean currents are carrying the radioactive water to the west coast. According to a study published in the journal Deep Sea Research 1, it'll begin arriving this coming March. But Makhijani says, don't panic. The radiation will be diluted, and levels found on the west coast are very low and not considered dangerous so far. But the question is, will we really know?
I think we should be doing better monitoring of food. I don't think the EPA and FDA are doing a good enough job.
The scariest part of Fukushima is not what has already happened. It's what could still happen. Every day is a desperate effort to keep the plant from melting down. What's distressing for many is the Japanese government is not overseeing the cleanup. Tokyo Electric and Power, or TEPCO, is a private, for-profit company.
They don't want to take the long-term viewpoint and just to save the money.
Japanese nuclear engineer Yasel Yamada came to America to shine a light on what he feels is a flawed approach. He says TEPCO is over their heads.
The cleanup job is too large for their capability.
Yamada is one of many experts who say this is a bad solution and that a meltdown is still possible, like Dr. Jimmy Hara with Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and professor of clinical family medicine at UCLA.
Well, it's like the fox overseeing the chicken coop, and it's a huge problem.
TEPCO and the Japanese government seem to have refused international help. I think that's most unwise.
Fukushima is potentially the biggest ticking time bomb in human history. The damaged plant is in no condition to withstand another massive earthquake or tsunami. These are photos of what happened to the original 19-foot seawall when the tsunami struck. It was shattered and, as we all know now, provided little protection. The tsunami flooded the plant, cut off the power, and the meltdown was underway. The plant's defenses today are far less.
It seems that nearly 1 million people have already died as a result of Chernobyl, despite what WHO says and the IAEA. This is one of the most monstrous cover-ups in the history of medicine, because everybody should know about this. Then we extrapolate through to Japan. Japan is, by orders of magnitude, many times worse than Chernobyl. Never in my life did I think that 6 nuclear reactors would be at risk. I knew the 3 GE engineers who helped design these Mark I GE reactors. They resigned because they knew they were dangerous. So Japan built them on an earthquake fault. The reactors partially withstood the earthquake, but the tsunami, but the external electricity supply was cut off, and the external electricity supply supplies the cooling water 1 million gallons a minute to each of those 6 reactors. Without the cooling water, the water falls and the rods are so hot they melt, like at 3 Mile Island and at Chernobyl. So the emergency diesel generators, which are as large as a house, got destroyed by the tsunami. So there is no way to keep the water circulating in the reactors. Also, on the roofs of the reactors, not within the containment vessel, are cooling pools. Every year they remove about 30 tons of the most radioactive rods that you could possibly imagine. Each one is 12 feet long and ½ an inch thick. Gives out so much radiation, like X-rays, that if you stand next to it for a couple of minutes, you'll die. Not drop dead, but with, remember Litvinenko, the Russian who got poisoned by polonium? You'll die like that, with your hair falling out, bleeding to death and dying of massive infection, like AIDS patients die. So these are, and they're thermally hot, so they have to be put in a big pool and continually cooled too. The pool has really no roof. There have been 3 hydrogen explosions blowing off the roof of the building, not the containment vessel of the core, but the roof, and exposing the cooling pool. 2 of the cooling pools are dry. They have no water in them, meaning that the nuclear fuel rods are covered with a material called zirconium. When zirconium is exposed to air, it burns, it ignites. And there have been 2 of the fueling pools at this moment are burning. In the cooling pools are many times, like 10 to 20 times more radiation than in each reactor core. In each reactor core is as much long-lived radiation as that produced by 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. We are dealing with diabolical energy. E equals mc squared. It's the energy that blows up nuclear bombs. Einstein said nuclear power is a hell of a way to boil water, because that is all nuclear power is used for, to boil water through the massive heat, turn it into steam, turn a turbine which generates electricity. Now when you fission uranium, 200 new elements are formed, all of which are much more poisonous to the body than the original uranium. Although uranium's pretty poisonous, America used it in Fallujah and Baghdad, and in Fallujah 80% of the babies being born are grossly deformed. They're being born without brains, single eyes, no arms. The doctors have told the women to stop having babies. The incidence of childhood cancer has gone up about 12 times. This is genocide. It's a nuclear war being conducted in Iraq. But uranium that they're using lasts for more than 4.5 billion years. So we're contaminating the cradle of civilization, the coalition of the willing. In the nuclear power plants, however, is a huge amount of radiation. 200 elements. Some last seconds, some last millions of years. Radioactive iodine lasts 6 weeks. It causes thyroid cancer. That's why people are saying better take potassium iodide, because that blocks the thyroid uptake of radioactive iodine, which later can cause thyroid cancer. In Chernobyl, over 20,000 people have developed thyroid cancer. They have to have their thyroids out, and they will die unless they take thyroid replacement every day, like a diabetic has to take insulin. Strontium-90 will get out. It lasts for 600 years. It goes to the bone, where it causes bone cancer or leukemia. Cesium lasts for 600 years. It's all over Europe. 40% of Europe is still radioactive. Turkish food is extremely radioactive. Do not buy Turkish dried apricots. Do not buy Turkish hazelnuts or dried... the Turks were so cross with the Russians, they sent all their radioactive tea over to Russia after Chernobyl. But 40% of Europe is still radioactive. Farms in Britain, their lambs are so full of cesium they can't sell them. Don't eat European food. But that's nothing compared to what's happening now. One of the most deadly is plutonium, named after Pluto, god of the underworld. 1 millionth of a gram, if you inhale it, will give you cancer. Hypothetically, 1 pound, if evenly distributed, could give everyone on Earth cancer. Each reactor has 250 kilos of plutonium in it, kilograms. You only need 2.5 kilograms to make a bomb, because plutonium is what they make bombs with. It's the only country that has a reactor. From your uranium, you are the biggest exporters of uranium in the world, Cameco. Canada sells two things. It sells wheat for life and uranium for death. Right? Plutonium is going to get out and spread all over the northern hemisphere, and it's already heading towards North America now. Plus radioactive iodine-129, its half-life is 17 million years, plus strontium, plus cesium, plus tritium, and I could go on and on and on. When it rains, down comes fallout, and it concentrates in food. If it gets into the sea, the algae concentrated hundreds of times, then the crustaceans concentrated hundreds of times, then the little fish, then the big fish, then us. Because we stand on the apex of the food chain. You can't taste these radioactive elements, you can't see them, and you can't smell them. They're silent. When you get them inside your body, you don't suddenly drop dead of cancer. It takes 5 to 60 years to get your cancer. And when the cancer, if you feel a lump in your breast, doesn't say, I was made by some strontium-90 you ate in a piece of fish 20 years ago. All radiation is damaging. It's cumulative. Each dose you get adds to your risk of getting cancer. With americium, that's more dangerous than plutonium. I mean, I could go on and on. Depends if it rains, if you're going to get it or not. If it rains and the radiation comes down, don't grow food, don't eat the food, and I mean don't eat it for 600 years. The radioactive waste from nuclear power is going to be buried, I hear, just like next to Lake Ontario. It's going to leak, last for millions of years. It's going to get into the water, into the food chains. Radioactive waste will induce epidemics of cancer, leukemia, and genetic disease for the rest of time. This is the greatest public health hazard the world has ever witnessed, apart from the threat every day of nuclear war. Einstein said the splitting of the atom changed everything save man's mode of thinking. Very profound. Thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. We are arrogant, we have a lot of hubris, and I think the reptilian midbrain of some men's brains is pathological. We are now in a situation where we have harnessed the energy of the sun. It is totally out of control, and there's simply nothing we can do about it.
If, in fact, the fourth plant goes under an earthquake and those rods are exposed, it's bye-bye Japan. And everybody on the west coast of North America should evacuate. Now, if that isn't terrifying, I don't know what is.
It's a global, universal, equal opportunity killer. And we can't see it, we can't taste it, you can't even measure it in the rain because it's low levels. But as it rains out, every day it accumulates in the environment. And what they're doing is serving us a dose of radiation that will last for thousands of years, that has contaminated all of North America.
On Sunday, radioactive water will be discharged into the sea. Meanwhile, workers are investigating a possible leak from reactor number 3. And while Japan seeks to prevent future disasters, international concern is growing over the handling of the current nuclear crisis.
Our investigation revealed an unexpected fact that made the aftermath of the accident worse. It turns out a safety mechanism might have had the tendency to become harder to operate as the crisis worsened. Furthermore, not just the tsunami, but also the earthquake may have had a critical impact, though TEPCO has denied it.
Given the scale of the earthquake, it's possible some devices were not sufficiently quake-proof. We cannot deny the possibility that they suffered damage and caused leaks.
During the Fukushima crisis, 3 reactors melted down in succession. The radioactive materials they released have contaminated the soil. More than 160,000 residents are still unable to return home.
We're in totally uncharted territories. You get any nuclear engineering book, look at the last chapter, and this scenario is not contained in the last chapter of any nuclear engineering textbook on the planet Earth. So they're making it up as they go along, and we are the guinea pigs for this science experiment.
You know, right now we're seeing the Japanese government is in chaos. The fact that the revelation of this extensive contamination is coming now more than 2 years after the accident occurred indicates that it's completely out of control. And the command and control is in chaos in Japan right now. And really the big question is, why aren't they calling international aid to address the radioactive contamination of the Pacific Ocean?
Why do you suspect they aren't calling international aid?
The problems are, I think, clearly that there's no transparency, and the government and the industry, as documented by the Japanese their Congress, is that there's been a collusion all along. And so what we're seeing is a veil being drawn over the accident to promote an agenda for the restart of these reactors in Japan, and to try to contain the bad news rather than the radiation.
That's very concerning, because the radiation is much worse than just the news itself. Now, what can be done beyond these dams that you mentioned before in terms of contaminating the leakage?
Well, you know, in order to contain the leaks, we have to isolate the radioactive waste. But indications are right now that the reactor structures themselves have been breached. It's very likely that some of the radioactive material, the melted cores, have moved into the earth, and so the containing, it's beyond containment right now. I think that's the tragedy that we see unfolding as Fukushima's radioactive water crisis is only beginning.
That's very concerning. How far has this radiation spread, and how fast is it going while it spreads?
Again, some of the radioactive isotopes are more mobile than others. The radioactive tritium, the hydrogen, it moves anywhere water goes because it is radioactive hydrogen and makes up a component of water. So the spread of the contamination is only going to be as effectively monitored as the technology is out there. And frankly, we don't know the full extent. Nobody really knows the full extent of the contamination at this point as it moves through not only groundwater but also through the atmosphere.
They brave the heat and humidity to come out in historic numbers. These protesters in Tokyo are demanding the government listen to citizens. Tens of thousands of people are here to say no to nuclear power. And Japanese have held protest after protest, urging the government to stop using atomic energy.
It would be a great shame for all Japanese if another nuclear accident happens again. I'm really angry with the terrible politics that politicians play.
At the beginning, we were getting fallout coming down in rain in the United States. And also, of course, the seafood. Not only does the ocean's currents bring the radioactivity this way, but also the sea life itself, the bluefin tuna, migrated from Japan to North America and carried the radioactive cesium in its flesh over here.
The mysterious die-off of West Coast sea stars is spreading.
The so-called melting sea stars were first noticed in Vancouver, then in Seattle, and now in California.
Few people would want to touch one of these. Sunflower sea stars infected with a strange melting disease, literally coming apart in the hands of biologists. The Seattle Aquarium sunflower sea stars are being held in isolated tanks away from the public. They're in quarantine.
Recently, within the past couple months, we had a huge starfish die-off along our coast. They're found from Alaska down to Baja, California, so no one knows exactly what is causing it.
I can't see any easy way of persuading the governments of the world and the scientific committees, the bogus scientific committees that they've set up to operate this system of chicanery and lies, any way of stopping them. I mean, to be honest, these people ought to be sent to jail, and perhaps one day that will happen, who knows. But at the moment, I see no sign of them backing off from what is clearly a very, very serious problem, and in my opinion, probably the worst public health scandal in human history, and one that is very likely set on destroying all life on Earth if it's continued unabated. This is really a serious, serious problem.
The problem is not really under control.
It will not be under control for, it's estimated, between 40 and 100 years from now.
There's no way to clean it up. They say 40 years, but they can't clean it up. They can't.
And the site's still unstable and vulnerable to natural disasters.
If there is another earthquake, a serious one, 6, 7, 8 or 9 magnitude, that would rattle all these 1,060 tanks. It would rattle the damaged cores, spent fuel, whose structures have already weakened. Yes, that's a potential very, very serious threat.
Approximately 300 tons of water was filtering through the site until early this month, becoming laced with radioactive materials and then seeping into the sea. Another factor is the ever-increasing amount of water accumulating inside damaged infrastructure. Once it makes its way into reactor buildings, it mixes with radioactive isotopes. For months, TEPCO workers have been pumping up 400 tons of water every day and storing it in tanks on site.
There's 1,060 tanks, stainless steel water tanks, that are holding the water which they keep pumping into the damaged reactors and the spent fuel storage pools.
From the air, the scale of the problems at Fukushima become clear. The growing mass of storage tanks now dwarfs the plant itself. More than 1 million tons of highly radioactive water is now stored here.
But the tanks have been hastily built. They're made of steel plates, bolted together, rather than welded. Last week, workers detected a major leak in one of those tanks. About 300 tons of water escaped, releasing several quadrillion becquerels of radioactive particles. Experts have often pointed out how vulnerable they are to damage.
The tanks, though, have been put together very quickly. There's no guarantee they'll last. Their seals are made of rubber, and the joints and bolts are corroding, and they may last not more than 5 years.
So the tank farm has grown dramatically, and it's on the hill. Of course, the problem is, because it's on the hill, the water flows down, and if there's an earthquake, all of these pipes are held together with plastic piping, not much different than what you've got on a swimming pool. So the plastic pipe will snap, and that water will just run right down that roadway directly into the ocean.
So the radiation has been leaking into the water and polluting the fish continuously for the last 2 years.
This graphic shows the gradual contamination of the Pacific Ocean due to leaks of radioactive water from the crippled Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. The simulation, which was run by a German marine research institute, shows the entire Pacific waters being polluted by radioactive water in just 6 years.
The fuel core of Unit 4 at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. More than 1,500 fuel rods sit in a damaged storage pool 30 meters above ground.
The amount of radioactivity in the rods themselves is about 14,000 times that of the Hiroshima.
They need to remove those fuel rods from the pool because if there's another earthquake, Building 4 would go down probably, and all those fuel rods would be exposed to the air and they would burn, and they would release 10 times more radiation or cesium than was released at Chernobyl, huge amounts, and pollute much of Japan and the Northern Hemisphere. So we're in a nuclear crisis at the moment.
If there's another earthquake and Building 4 collapses, which contains the cooling pool with fresh fuel, I'm going to evacuate my family from Boston.
So they've put a crane on top of that building, which is shaky anyway, and they're going to lift the fuel assemblies out one by one with the crane, and it will be done manually. Normally, those rods are removed by computer control with millimetres to spare. It's a very delicate operation.
The fuel rods must be kept submerged and must not touch each other or break. Nuclear experts warn any mishaps could cause an explosion many times worse than that one here in March 2011.
Because if several rods touch each other, you could reach criticality and the whole fuel pool could go critical. Or if the rods break as they're being lifted out, large amounts of radiation would escape from the rods and the area would have to be evacuated, meaning that if the area is evacuated, the continuous operation of cooling 5 spent fuel pools and 3 melted cores would stop. Need I go on?
The worst problem of all, which is not often mentioned, is that if we have an accident with the any of the 1,500 assemblies on top of unit number 4, we would have to abandon the site. If we have to abandon the site, and we would probably have to abandon Tokyo at the same time, then we cannot keep the 6,000 assemblies in the in-ground common pool cool, because those will boil off unless they get cold water continually rushing over them at all times. It will probably take 2 or 3 or 4 days for all the water to boil off so much so that the zirconium lining will burn and the radiation will be released. But the radiation from 6,000 assemblies, well, it would take about 40 days to circle the northern hemisphere, and you could move to the southern hemisphere and preserve your life for maybe a month more.
What?
Ladies and gentlemen, it is for me a great honor and a real pleasure to participate in this memorable event. In 1956, the Cold War was at its height. Nuclear war was menacing mankind, and my presidency alleged that the world was on the verge of total destruction. Today, the consequences of Fukushima threaten the world. Unit 4 contains 10 times more cesium-137 than Chernobyl. A strong earthquake could mean collapse. The Japanese people realized from experience that nuclear energy generates unacceptable calamities. The collapse of Unit 4 could be one. Japan must assume the historic role of promoting denuclearization, both civilian and military. Ignoring the conditions of the Fukushima, nuclear reactors continue to be promoted at home and abroad. Fukushima must not be forgotten. In the name of the victims and 170,000 refugees, I call for a total ban of nuclear energy. The world must realize that any radioactive contamination creates immense and permanent harm for mankind and the Earth. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima are no less dreadful than atomic bombs. Nuclear reactors are potential super bombs. No single weapon can compete with the potential damage that can be caused by Fukushima Unit 4 or reprocessing plants. The Fukushima accident could have been more catastrophic for Japan and the world. The still present danger of a collapse of Unit 4 after an intensity 7 earthquake must be broadcast the world over. Sound judgment would not have permitted construction of 54 nuclear reactors in a Japan menaced by frequent earthquakes and tsunamis. Only the lack of ethics and responsibility made it possible. Money and the corruption of power plant management sow the seeds of catastrophe. This is not limited to Japan. The same technology that produces nuclear energy produces nuclear weapons. The proliferation of nuclear power plants leads to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, as we are seeing today in North Korea and Iran. There is no way to ensure the safety of future generations except to eliminate the use of nuclear fission technology across the planet. The lack of ethics and responsibility is highlighted by the absence of a solution for nuclear waste that threatens future generations. The Japanese nuclear village or nuclear dictatorship envisions the restarting and export of nuclear reactors, thus regaining the offensive for the Japanese nuclear industry. This is immoral. It shows no sense of international or intergenerational responsibility. Alas, I fear it will last. Japan should warn the world of the consequences of not heading towards denuclearization. 8 years ago, I predicted that Japanese electric companies would decide Japan's fate. 2 years ago, at the World Congress of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War in Basel, I pleaded for mobilizing human wisdom to avert the ultimate catastrophe a nuclear calamity could produce. Sadly, these warnings did not deter my fears. Considering the worldwide consequences of a nuclear accident, countries not possessing nuclear reactors should urge denuclearization, be it military or civilian.
It's inappropriate for scientists to lie when the world is in the intensive care unit. One general said, if you take away our nuclear weapons, you're taking away the family jewels. Your government's full of corporate prostitutes, let's be frank. Yeltsin got to within 10 seconds of pressing the button. 10 seconds. Human fallibility, that's what we're dealing with. We have a technology now with which we have to be infallible. Hands up those who think they're infallible. You can easily turn it around.
Hope for the earth lies not with leaders, but in your own heart and soul. If you decide to save the earth, it will be saved. A person can be as powerful as the most powerful person who ever lived, and that is you, if you love this planet.